My wife was meeting another man at a gala dinner, so I prepared the divorce letter for her. When she arrived home, her eyes glowing with makeup and her shoulders still shrouded in the fragrance she'd once worn for me, I handed her the envelope with steady hands and a crumbling heart. She read every line in disbelief, the words echoing in the room with the weight of 1,000 truths. "I hope you're happy with your choice, I'm going to move on with my life," it said. Her lips trembled. She didn't ask if it was true, didn't try to deny it. She simply murmured in a choked voice, "How did you find out?" And I replied with a calm so cold it froze the air between us, "I just followed you. I saw everything. From the wine to the touch of your hands. From the lie in your eyes to the kiss hidden in the shadows." She sat, stunned, unable to hold back the tears. And yet, even with all the pain etched in her eyes, she didn't tell me she loved me. She just cried. And he left the next day, as if he hadn't destroyed a home, a life, an entire future. She chose to stay with him. That man who enchanted her with empty words and rehearsed gestures. Perhaps because he knew exactly where to touch, what to promise, how to fill the silences that I, so deeply in love, tried to fill with truth. In the days that followed, she disappeared from my life as if she'd never existed. No message, no apology, no regrets. Meanwhile, I tried to forget the absence of her socks scattered around the room, the sound of the dryer at 7 in the morning, the laughter that echoed in the kitchen on Sundays. I tried to rebuild myself from the shards of who I was with her. But no one rebuilds themselves the same way. Because when someone tears away the roots of who you were, what emerges afterward is never the same. It's another person, another version, harder, more skeptical, less available. I became that man. She thought she'd be happy. She thought love was replaceable, that all she had to do was find another embrace, another scent, another voice in the dark saying, "You're everything to me." But time has no mercy on those who treat love like a whim. Time punishes, corrodes, rubs memories in your face, and whispers in the night that you've destroyed everything you needed most. She felt it, too late. When the man she traded me for began to grow impatient, when passion turned into demands, when promises became routine. One day, he didn't show up. He disappeared from her life as if he'd never promised anything. And she sat there, sitting at the same table where my trust had departed, staring into the now bitter glass of wine. It was at that moment that she understood, she'd traded the love of her life for a fleeting illusion. The days passed like a silent haze. She began to remember me in the little things. In the coffee I brewed at just the right temperature. In the way I listened to her, even when she just wanted to talk about her day. In the way I held her during her nightmares and said, "It'll pass. I'm here." But now there was no more "I'm here." No more coffee, no more listening, no more hugs. There was silence. A silence so loud I screamed at her every morning. And when the realization hit, it was like an avalanche. Heavy. Irreversible. She lost me. And that's when he decided to look for me. Not to go back in time, that was no longer possible, but to ask for forgiveness. To confess he'd made a mistake, that he'd traded the right love for a moment of doubt, that he'd destroyed what he could never rebuild on his own. She found me. I saw her approaching, her eyes watering, her face that once smiled at me now marked by the weight of a wrong choice. She tried to smile, but her mouth faltered. And then she spoke. She said it all. That she regretted it, that she loved me, that she should never have left. That the spark she thought she'd found in another faded in a matter of weeks. And that only after losing me did she understand what true love was. That only after the emptiness did she realize how full she was when she was by my side. I listened to her in silence. Each word cut like a razor, not out of hate, but out of compassion. Because now I knew the pain she carried. And yet, I responded with something she hadn't expected, "I forgive you." Yes, I forgave her. Not because I'm better or nobler, but because forgiveness is the only way to free myself from everything she left in me. But when she smiled, believing it meant a chance, I took a deep breath and let out the sentence that shattered her heart into 1,000 pieces, but I moved on. She froze. She looked at me as if the world had collapsed for the second time. "Have you met someone?" she asked, her eyes pleading for a lie. But I just nodded. "Yes. And now, I'm loved the way I loved you. Without a doubt, no games, no half-truths." She cried right there. Like I cried alone in the bathroom that night after I saw her with another man. The ground shifted. And she felt what I felt. The irreversible loss. The love that was no longer available. The screaming absence. The touch that already belongs to another skin. I reached out. She held it. But for the last time. Because forgiveness isn't synonymous with return. It's merely the key that unlocks the door to moving on, each of us, in peace. Life takes turns. Sometimes, turns that destroy. Other times, turns that teach. She learned. But she learned too late. And me? Well. I finally knew what it was like to be the chosen one, not the one left behind. But what she found inside that box of letters, hidden deep in the closet of the house where we lived for so many years, was what destroyed her completely. Because there, in the words I once wrote, she saw the version of me that died the day she betrayed me. And what was in that last letter, is something that not even forgiveness could erase. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal isn't romance, it's ruin. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths. Our goal is to show, unfiltered, how betrayal destroys homes, hearts, and entire lives. Each story is a warning, not a celebration. Prepare yourself. You are about to hear a shocking story. Good listening. His name was Daniel, hers was Laura. Two simple, ordinary names, like so many stories that begin and end in some discreet corner of the world. But what united them was anything but ordinary. Their love wasn't overwhelming at first, it didn't explode with sparks or rapture, but was born of something rarer, care. They met at a photography class for beginners, on a cloudy Saturday morning, when Daniel noticed Laura didn't know how to adjust the camera's shutter and offered to help. She smiled with her eyes before even smiling with her lips, and he, distracted by the way she tilted her head slightly to listen, lost focus of her explanation. From that moment on, they began to meet by chance, then by intention, until they never lost each other again. Daniel was a systems analyst. He worked with codes, logic, and predictability. He had a calm, discreet personality, the kind of man who thinks twice before saying something that could hurt. He was always the kind of man who preferred to resolve things in silence, not for lack of courage, but because he believed that the right word at the right time was more powerful than screams uttered in desperation. Laura, on the other hand, was intense. A literature teacher, her gaze carried a passion for words and her body the urgency of someone who feels too much. She cried watching margarine commercials, laughed out loud when reading passages from books aloud on the couch, and had a habit of hugging tightly, as if always trying to capture a little time between her arms. They complemented each other in their differences. Daniel brought structure, calm, and grounding. Laura injected color, momentum, and movement. Their relationship grew with a naturalness that felt like destiny. They moved in together after 2 years of dating, when they realized they were already sleeping together more nights than apart. Their home was a reflection of their lives, simple, cozy, full of subtle details, like the frames with analog photos they took on their travels, or the notes stuck to the fridge with loving reminders and little inside jokes. They had a cat named Bento, who was more Laura's but always slept next to Daniel. On Sundays, she made pancakes and he washed the dishes listening to jazz. On rainy nights, they watched old movies and discussed alternate endings as if they were screenwriters. There was love there. Love in everything. Of course, they weren't perfect. No one is. They had their fights, like any couple. Laura was impulsive, sometimes saying too much and regretting it later. Daniel, on the other hand, was so reserved that he sometimes seemed distant. She complained that he never opened up enough, that he wanted to know more than he felt, while he said he demonstrated it in his actions. But despite the arguments, there was a silent pact between them to always return to each other. A commitment that went beyond paper, rings, or dinners with mutual friends. An agreement of soul, of presence, of continuity. Time passed, and with it came small challenges. Routines began to overshadow surprises. Work consumed more time than it should have. Laura had taken on a heavier workload to help a colleague who was on leave and began arriving home later. Daniel had also taken on new projects and spent nights immersed in spreadsheets and reports. Their time together diminished. Conversations, once so long and filled with stories of the day, became quick, practical, almost mechanical. There was still affection, of course, but it began to camouflage itself amidst the daily tasks. It was a "good morning" between sips of coffee, "sleep well" with a kiss on the forehead, and an "I love you" said automatically, like a reminder of something they knew but no longer felt with the same intensity. Laura began pursuing new interests, returning to cultural events with college friends, themed dinners, and lectures. Daniel, on the other hand, retreated deeper into his comfortable bubble. He sensed something was different, but couldn't quite pinpoint what. He tried to talk, tried to schedule dinners just the two of them, rekindle rituals that once united them. But Laura always seemed busy, always surrounded by new things, always with a new topic that no longer included them. She smiled, but her eyes no longer lingered on his. She started wearing new perfumes, dressing up more than usual, and when he complimented her, she thanked him with a distracted smile, as if the comment no longer had the power to move her. Even so, Daniel persisted. Not with flowers or grand gestures, but with his presence. He bought her the chocolate she liked, recorded the TV shows she missed, made her the tea that helped her sleep. He believed that love was made of persistence, of attention to detail, even when the other seemed distant. He believed that every difficult phase was just that, a phase. And that it would pass. Because he was certain she loved him. Because she said so. Even if sometimes her look said otherwise. And he chose to believe the words, not the silence. There was, at that point in their relationship, an uncomfortable sense of waiting. Daniel hoped she would return to her old self. Laura, for her part, seemed in constant search of something she couldn't even name. Between them, a kind of silent abyss formed, full of small, unspoken disappointments and unmet needs. There was no guilt, at least not yet. There was disconnection. There was absence. But there was still love, somehow. The kind of love that survives pauses, that endures even without applause. Until an invitation arrived. A charity gala dinner, hosted by a former colleague of Laura's. She was excited. She talked about it for days, planning her dress, her hair, her shoes. Daniel, even exhausted, said he could go with her. But she declined with a gentle smile, "You'll be tired, love. There will be a lot of people, a lot of noise. You hate that kind of thing." He hesitated, but eventually agreed. He trusted her. And perhaps, deep down, he thought that letting her go would be a way to recapture the lightness that had existed between them. That night, she left with a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. And he stayed home, with bento on his lap, watching a rerun of an old movie they used to watch together. That night, something inside him tightened differently. A dull unease, a restlessness he couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy. It was absence. It was as if he were alone in a house filled with the memories of someone who still lived there but no longer belonged there. He tried to distract himself, but ended up picking up his phone and reviewing photos of the two of them. Trips, birthdays, trivial moments. Everything there seemed distant, as if it belonged to a couple who no longer existed. Across town, Laura smiled, chatted, toasted. She was beautiful. She was noticed. Admired. She felt alive. And perhaps, at that moment, she didn't even remember that back home, there was someone still waiting for her. Someone who believed that love was stronger than any distance. Someone who never stopped trying. Their story still stood. But the walls were beginning to crack. And neither of them realized that the signs were already everywhere. In gestures, in looks, in words left unsaid. They still slept in the same bed. They still shared the same roof. But what united them now was as fragile as the silence that filled the space between one sentence and the next. And it was in this silence that destiny began, little by little, to write the cruelest chapter in history. Laura began attending more and more nightlife events, and with it came new names, new faces, new stories that didn't include Daniel. She talked about people he'd never met, mentioned places he'd never been, and shared laughs that were no longer part of their nights at home. She was still kind, still kissing his forehead before bed, but the touch was too light, like a wave, not a gesture of someone wanting to stay. Daniel, for his part, struggled to balance acceptance with growing discomfort. He began to notice frequent delays, evasive text responses, a look that was always a little distant, as if she were there but at the same time no longer was. Her scent changed, her routine changed, the enthusiasm with which she spoke of him changed. Her clothes, once chosen for comfort, now adopted bolder, more elegant patterns. Her phone, previously kept by the bed, was now always on silent, face down. Daniel tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe he was just too insecure. Maybe he was reading too much into the signs. But the discomfort grew, day after day, like an insistent drop that pierces even the stone. He began to observe her without wanting to, searching for traces that would confirm or deny what he feared. And the more he tried to deny his own intuition, the more evident it became. It was as if an invisible space had formed between them, and his every attempt to fill that void was met with more distance, more coldness. There was something there that was unspoken, but that screamed in the silence. On a typical Wednesday, she went out to dinner, which she claimed was with a group of colleagues from a symposium. Daniel asked if she wanted him to come along, and she replied with a mechanical smile that it would be something boring, technical, and that he wouldn't enjoy it. She groomed herself with unusual care, lingered in front of the mirror, tested 2 perfumes before choosing one, and left the room with almost too light a step. When the door closed behind her, Daniel stood there for a moment, observing the empty space she'd left in the air. There was a lump in his throat, but he couldn't tell if it was jealousy, fear, or simply the harbinger of the end. He couldn't sleep. He tried to distract himself with books, movies, even games on his phone. But the clock seemed to mock his anxiety, and time, which had once flowed like the wind, now dragged on like an eternity. He got in his car, drove aimlessly, crossed avenues, stopped in front of the cafe where they usually went on Saturdays, and then continued downtown, as if the hustle and bustle of the city could calm his restlessness. It was then that he saw it. By chance, by fate, by one of those coincidences that seem written by invisible hands. The restaurant was brightly lit, with an imposing facade, and at the entrance, amid the glitter of luxury cars and the forced smiles of elegant guests, Laura was there. Not with colleagues. Not among friends. But with him. The man had a confident posture, a clean-shaven beard, and tailored clothing. He walked beside her as if he were intimate with her body, her steps. And she smiled. Not the polite smile she used to defend herself from Daniel, not the formal smile at family dinners, but the smile of someone who is surrendered, light, alive. Daniel stopped the car across the street, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, his heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo in his ribs. He watched as they entered together, as she fixed his hair for him, as their eyes met as if the world around them were just a frame. He didn't go any further. He didn't storm into the restaurant, didn't shout her name, didn't make a fuss. He just stood there, alone in the dark, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. It was true. Everything he'd tried to ignore, everything he'd suspected in the small gestures, the overlapping schedules, the vague excuses. It was true. And seeing it with his own eyes was crueler than any hypothesis. The confirmation came with a bitter taste he would never forget. Returning home, Daniel didn't cry. He was numb. He arrived, took off his shoes, washed his face, made tea, the same one he used to make for her, and sat on the sofa, staring into space. Everything seemed out of place. The rug, the painting, the bookshelf with her books. He began writing the letter that very night. Not a letter of hate, nor of accusation. But a silent, dignified farewell. Precise, cutting words, spoken with the dignity of someone who loved until the end and decided, finally, not to betray himself to keep what the other had already destroyed. I hope you're happy with your choice. I'm going to move on with my life. That's what she wrote. No drama, no exaggeration. Just the truth. The same truth she denied with words but confirmed with actions. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in a white envelope, and left it on the dining table. Then she went to sleep, or at least tried to. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by images of her with the other man, by good memories that now turned to poison. By the idea that she had given everything she had and still it wasn't enough. She arrived late that night. Silent. As if she knew something was different in the air. She saw the envelope. She read it. And for the first time in a long time, her eyes truly filled. There was no shouting, no arguing, just the silence broken by the sound of the paper being read. She looked around, searching for Daniel, but he wasn't there. He'd gone for a walk. She sat in the chair, the envelope still in her hand, trying to understand how he knew. How he discovered what she had been trying to hide even from herself. The letter hurt because it didn't ask for explanations. Because there was no room for regrets. Just one statement, he had seen. He knew. And now he was leaving her free to choose. In the days that followed, Laura left the apartment. Driven not by resentment, but by shame. Coexistence became impossible. She didn't apologize, not then. She was too lost in her own conflicts. The man she'd been with still kept in touch, still seemed present, and she believed, or convinced herself, that she could make this new life work. After all, she'd already caused too much damage to go back. But the weeks passed, and with them, the relationship that had seemed so vibrant began to show its cracks. The enthusiasm faded into automatic gestures. His touch was cold. The silences were long. And Laura began to realize there was no room for the most fragile parts of her. With Daniel, she could be imperfect, she could be real. With this new man, she was just image, appearance, spectacle. It was then that the longing began to set in. Not in an obvious way, but in the little things. The note folded inside a book. The way he made coffee and left it ready before he left. The inside jokes, the comfort of a home where she could effortlessly be herself. But now it was too late. Daniel was far away. And as much as she still thought about him, she didn't know if there was any more room for regret. Or for forgiveness. She just knew that something inside her had broken. And that maybe that something was irreparable. But what Laura didn't yet know, was that the loss she felt wasn't the greatest of all. What awaited her in the reunion she dared to seek carried more weight than abandonment. Because behind the forgiveness she so longed to hear lay a truth that would change everything. And that truth, hidden inside a simple, forgotten box, had the power to shatter what was left of her. It took Laura a while to gather her courage. Pride was overcome by emptiness, and emptiness by longing. After weeks of silence, she decided to reach out to him. The number was still the same. She called 3 times and hung up before hearing the first ring. On the 4th try, he answered. His voice was calm, almost distant. She asked if they could meet. He hesitated, but agreed. She arranged for a late afternoon meeting at the same cafe where, years ago, they had discussed names for a possible child. She arrived first. She sat at the back table. She was nervous, but determined. She wanted to apologize, she wanted to say everything she had kept bottled up over the past few months, she wanted to try something she herself didn't know was possible, starting over. When Daniel arrived, he was calm, but there was something different in his gaze, a firmness she hadn't recognized. She sat down, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. Time settled between them like an old friend unsure whether to embrace or demand an explanation. Laura broke the silence. She said she thought about him every day, that she tried to move on with someone else, but that only there, without him, did she understand what it meant to be truly loved. She said the other man never really knew her, that he never knew how to care the way Daniel did. She confessed she didn't want the past back, because she knew it was too hurtful, but that she wanted a new chance. A real chance. She promised truth, she promised dedication, she promised patience. Daniel listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, he took a deep breath and said he forgave her. He said it sincerely. There was no anger in his voice. There was liberation. She smiled with teary eyes, thinking the worst was over. But what came next shattered everything that was left intact in her. Daniel looked at his hands for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, and then said he had moved on. That he no longer lived in that house. That he no longer waited for her. That he had learned, through pain, that love must be mutual to survive. And that, while she was seeking other hands, he learned to love again. Laura couldn't hide her shock. She tried to smile, but it was like trying to hold together a bridge that had already cracked. She asked if he was with someone. He said yes. He didn't elaborate. But he said he was fine. That he was different. That he finally felt seen. She lowered her eyes, trying to hold back the tears, but the pain was too great. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, to see him one last time. Not at the cafe. In the house where they'd lived. She wanted, she said, to close that chapter with respect. She wanted to look at it all one last time and say goodbye to what she destroyed. Daniel hesitated, but agreed. They scheduled it for the following Saturday. When she arrived, she wore an expression that mixed nostalgia and defeat. The place seemed untouched. The photos had been removed from the walls, but the scent of her old life still lingered in the air. She walked slowly through the rooms, touching furniture, observing the marks of time. She stopped at the bookshelf. She smiled when she saw one of the literature books he hadn't yet returned to her. When she turned, she saw a small wooden box on the table. Daniel noticed her look and told her it was hers. That he had kept, out of respect, things she had left behind. She approached. She opened the box. Inside were letters. Many letters. She recognized the handwriting immediately. They were hers, written over the years, on special dates, on ordinary days. Letters she'd left him on birthdays, in notes hidden in his pillow, love messages. But at the bottom of the box was one she'd never seen before. A letter not written by her. A letter written by him. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the envelope. It was old. The page, yellowed at the edges, looked like it had been kept for years. Laura hesitated, but opened it. And what she read was like a blow. Daniel had written that letter a long time ago, during a trip they took in their 3rd year of dating. It was a goodbye letter. He thought she would leave him back then. In it, he recounted the days he felt invisible, the moments he believed she no longer loved him. He said that if she had left on that trip, he would have understood. But that, even so, he would continue to love her. And that, if she stayed, he promised to be better. More patient. Stronger. More present. What devastated her wasn't the letter. But the fact that she'd never known of its existence. That man, years ago, had already felt the distance growing. He'd already suffered from doubt. And yet, he remained. Silently. Fighting. Trying. Loving. And she never saw. Never noticed. After finishing reading, Laura placed the letter on the table with trembling hands. Daniel watched her silently, but his eyes were filled with something she didn't immediately recognize, sadness, but also liberation. She murmured, her voice broken, that if she had read that letter earlier, she would have done everything differently. He replied that maybe yes, maybe no. Because the truth was, she wasn't ready for that love back then. And now, he was no longer there to offer it. Laura burst into tears. There was no anger, no pleading. Only pain. A pain so deep it seemed to come from her gut. That letter, so simple, so honest, revealed everything she'd never seen. Everything she'd ignored. Everything she'd neglected. It wasn't the betrayal that was destroying her now. It was the realization of how much she'd been loved. How much she'd had, and how much she'd lost. Daniel came closer. He touched her hand. He said he wanted her to be happy. He said she deserved peace. But their love had ended there, inside that box, along with all the words she'd never read. She left the house with tears still in her eyes. And when she crossed the threshold, she understood. The forgiveness she'd been seeking so desperately was granted. But what she really needed wasn't forgiveness. It was a return to the past. And that, no love, no matter how true, could offer. Laura left that house with shuffling steps, as if every inch between the sofa and the door weighed like an extra year on her shoulders. The gate closed with a soft creak, but inside her, the rumble was devastating. Daniel's letter still throbbed in her mind like an old lament that now, finally, made sense. The way he wrote with so much love, so much contained pain, and yet chose to stay, hurt more than any words spoken in that cafe. The wind blew in her face, but it was inside that she was falling apart. And for the first time, she didn't know where to go. The apartment where she lived with the other man was no longer hers. The other man, now, was nothing more than a shadow in her memory. They hadn't seen each other in weeks. Their last conversation was cold, almost a mutual, wordless breakup. It was the end of something that never began. Now, the only thing left was the echo of poor choices and the weight of no longer having a place where she could be welcomed. Daniel didn't follow her out. He stood in the hallway, motionless, his eyes fixed on the doorway through which she had disappeared. In his mind, there was no pride or sense of victory. There was only silence. The same silence that had filled the home for months, but now seemed finally peaceful. With the box of letters in hand, he returned to his room and put everything away in the back of the drawer. Not out of anger. Not out of attachment. But because he no longer wanted to carry loose memories. It was time to organize what hurt. It was time to turn the page. 2 days later, Laura received a message from Daniel's sister. Something simple, not accusatory, just asking if she was okay. She responded coolly. She didn't want to seem weak. But after sending the text, she stared at the screen for long minutes, wishing someone, anyone, would tell her it was still fixable. No one did. At the end of that week, Daniel was seen at a restaurant on the other side of town, accompanied by someone. The woman was discreet, with brown hair tied in a simple bun, a gentle smile, and a serene gaze. She wasn't exuberant, she didn't draw attention. But there was a familiar light in her eyes, the one Laura had lost over time. A mutual friend told her, without malice, without irony, simply as someone sharing something of life as it goes on. Laura feigned indifference. She thanked him for the information with an emoji, but hung up the phone and cried in the bathroom for almost an hour. It wasn't just jealousy. It was a deeper, darker pain, of someone realizing, too late, that she had been replaced not by someone better, but by someone who simply knew how to value what she had despised. The following week, she called Daniel again. She wanted to return some books. She wanted to find some excuse to justify another conversation. He answered with the same calm voice as always. He set a time. He said he'd prefer if she left the books with the concierge. But she insisted on delivering them in person. He relented, not out of desire, but out of politeness. She arrived with a small bag and eyes that avoided his. He opened the door, thanked her, and when she started to turn away, he said perhaps it would be best if they spoke there, once and for all, to end everything with dignity. She nodded and sat down. The conversation started off superficially. They exchanged phrases about the weather, about work, about things that didn't matter. But all it took was a pause too long for the silence to speak louder. Laura was the first to give in. She said she still loved him. That she would never stop loving him. That she understood if he had moved on, but that she needed to talk, even if only to ease the burden she carried. Daniel listened, without interrupting. He looked into her eyes, but not as before. Not with the warmth of someone who belongs, but with the calm of someone who has already departed within. He answered honestly. He said he, too, loved her like he'd never loved anyone. That for a long time, he'd fought alone, believing it was worth keeping alive something only he could nurture. He said the betrayal wasn't just the kiss with another man, not just the body surrendered to someone outside their history, but the silent surrender. The emotional abandonment. The slow, fatal disconnection she never acknowledged while it was happening. Laura tried to interrupt him, but he continued. He said he didn't blame her. That he forgave her, yes. But that now he understood his own worth. And that he deserved to be loved without begging for it. She cried there, again. Not with despair, but with shame. With sadness. Not because of his words, but because of everything she hadn't seen when she could have done things differently. Daniel then revealed that, after everything, he'd learned to see love in the simple things. That he'd met someone who didn't make him doubt whether he was enough. Someone who laughed at his bad jokes, who asked how his day was, and truly listened. Who looked at him the way she had in those early years, but without fear, without doubt, without guilt. Laura asked for only one thing. That he be happy. He smiled, for the first time that day, and said he was trying. She stood, handed him the bag of books, and said goodbye. Not as someone hoping for a new beginning, but as someone recognizing that that story, however beautiful it had once been, now had to end. A few days later, Laura returned to the coffee shop where they used to dream aloud. She sat alone, ordered the same latte as always, and watched the couples around her. She wondered how many of them were about to lose their way. How many knew what they held in their hands? How many could still change the course of their own lives? As she left, she passed the bookstore across the street and saw a book in the window with a prominent passage, "Love doesn't end when it ends. It ends when it's wasted." She smiled wistfully. That phrase wasn't just a metaphor. It was the epitaph of the story itself. Another week passed, and on a cold night, Laura decided to write to Daniel. Not to ask for him back, nor to win him back. But to thank him. She wrote a long, sincere message, in which she said she now understood what he tried to show her so many times. That only after losing everything did she learn to see how much she was loved. He asked her to never stop being who she was, because the world needed more people like him. And he ended by saying that if they ever crossed paths by chance, she hoped he'd greet her with a smile, not for the past, but for everything they'd learned. Daniel read the message in silence. He took a deep breath, smiled slightly, and didn't respond. He put his phone in his pocket and returned to the dinner he had prepared with Sophia, the woman who now occupied, with sweetness and dignity, the space that had once been Laura's. In the background, soft music filled the room. Life, finally, had sound again. Meanwhile, Laura moved on. She kept living. With scars that time would not erase, but with a new awareness of love. She learned, too late, that love doesn't need to scream to be immense. And that sometimes, the one who leaves isn't the one who gives up, it's the one who loves themselves enough to stop insisting where there's no longer room. And even without Daniel by her side, it was there, in that moment of silence between regret and lucidity, that she finally understood the magnitude of what she had lost. And that truth would be the only companion that would never leave her. From that night on, when Laura wrote and Daniel chose silence as his response, the days moved in opposite directions, and this distance ceased to be merely physical, it became existence. Laura began to walk through life with a weight that was invisible, but which shaped her steps. She still smiled at meetings with friends, still showed up to work with the same poise she always had, still read books, watched movies, made her weekly to-do lists, and organized her mornings with almost mathematical rigidity, but everything was done with an imperceptible trace of lack. It was as if every small action that once gave her pleasure now seemed to echo in an empty space, like a gesture made in front of a dusty mirror. Time didn't stop for her, and that was what hurt most, knowing that things continued, that the world was unmoved by the pain she hid deep within her chest. No one really knew the extent of what she had lost, nor could anyone understand that what she regretted most was not the betrayal itself, but the silent contempt that grew within her until it became a choice. She tried to distract herself, pursued new habits, considered resuming an old course or taking that trip she'd always put off, but everything felt artificial. Nothing rang true. The only time her sense of life returned was when, by chance, she stumbled upon old memories. A song playing in the back of a supermarket, a couple smiling on the street with the same kind of complicity she'd once known, or the smell of food that reminded her of lazy Sundays with Daniel. In those moments, something in her body froze. It was as if everything inside her was organizing itself just to revive, even if only for a few seconds, a version of herself she'd left behind. It wasn't masochism. It was nostalgia with a taste of mourning. Daniel, on the other hand, no longer let himself be haunted by the past. But neither did he forget. True love, even when ended, never disappears completely, it merely changes shape, loses its vivid color, and becomes a sepia memory, only returning with force on rainy days or in conversations about all that could have been. He didn't wish Laura Illinois. He held no grudges. What sustained him now was the feeling that he was finally in a place where he could breathe without being hurt. Sophia, with her gentle, secure presence, brought a new kind of peace. It wasn't an intense or blind passion, but a serene, mature construction, built on constant presence and mutual respect. For the first time, he didn't need to prove himself, nor mend silences. She saw him. Not as a project, not as the foundation of a selfish dream, but as a whole, real man, with flaws and qualities that didn't need to be hidden. Even so, there was a sensitivity within Daniel that made him question. On nights when the new routine became too silent, he found himself wondering if he had been too hard on Laura. If the forgiveness he offered had truly been enough to free her, or if, by refusing any possibility of reconciliation, he had chosen the easy way out. But these doubts didn't last. He only had to remember the emotional exhaustion, the way he tried and she deflected, the moments he was alone within a shared relationship. He knew there was no going back, not out of pride, but because love, when repeatedly wounded, doesn't die with screams, it simply fades into silence. Laura's dilemma deepened as she watched Daniel from afar. It was as if her mind were split between two worlds, the real one, where he now belonged to another story, and the imagined one, where she could undo her mistakes, go back in time, and rewrite the chapters she'd torn apart with impulsive choices. She often thought about seeking him out again, not to insist on a return, but to understand. She wanted to understand how he'd managed to rebuild himself so quickly, how he'd been able to love again, as if his world hadn't been shattered by the same pain. Deep down, perhaps she wished he'd tell her he'd also suffered, that he'd also been lost, that he'd also cried, because that would make her feel less alone in the guilt that now overwhelmed her. But Daniel remained silent. His social media didn't boast happiness, but rather showed a simple life, full of small joys. A candlelit dinner with Sophia. A walk in a park. A photo of the two of them holding cups of coffee with the caption, "Lightness." Laura saw this image one night while trying to sleep, and when she saw his smile, she felt as if the universe had truly turned a page. It was a look that no longer sought her. It was a look full of peace. As the months passed, the visits of longing became more spaced out. The pain was still there, but it had become a scar. What began as a crushing guilt was now a constant melancholy. Laura began to reflect on what it truly meant to love someone. She understood, the hard way, that love is not sustained solely by admiration or desire, but by the daily choice to remain, even when it would be easier to leave. And she didn't choose to remain. At the first chance to be dazzled by the new, the exciting, the fleeting, she broke with what was solid. And now, seeing Daniel at peace, she understood that the biggest mistake wasn't betraying him, but abandoning what he had built with so much effort. One afternoon, while walking into an antique shop, Laura saw an old picture frame, made of worn wood, with small signs of age. Inside was an old photograph of a smiling couple, holding hands, sitting by a river. It was impossible not to remember a similar image she had with Daniel, taken on a spontaneous trip, back when they both still believed they were eternal. She took the object in her hands and for a moment felt the symbolic weight of what it represented. She didn't buy it. She left the shop with tears in her eyes and understood that, despite everything, her pain wouldn't kill her. But it would never completely leave her. Meanwhile, Daniel began planning a new phase with Sophia. They talked about moving in together, maybe traveling at the end of the year, maybe adopting a puppy. Everything was simple, but everything was true. He still kept the box of letters. Not out of attachment, but out of respect for what he'd experienced. He wouldn't part with it because he knew you can't erase a story, you just learn to put it in its rightful place on the shelf. And now, Laura's story belonged to the past. A past he respected, but one that no longer controlled his steps. Time went on. And life, as it always does, tried to reorganize what was broken. But even with the reconstruction, there was something that would never be completely resolved. There was a hole in Laura that would not be filled with new experiences, nor with new names, nor with justifications. It was the kind of pain you learn to live with. You can't overcome it. And deep down, she knew that that wound was the most painful proof of how much she was loved. And although the world around her moved on, she finally understood that betrayal isn't just an act. It's a breaking point. An internal collapse that, when it happens, drags away everything that was built, trust, affection, the future. Everything shatters, sometimes irreversibly. And when you realize it, there's no bridge back. Only the road ahead, lonely, long, full of regrets. But still, the only one left. Laura began to observe life with a painful lucidity, as if everything around her had become clearer after the shock of loss. Nothing felt light anymore. Smiles seemed rehearsed, hugs felt hollow, and the days became long repetitions of tasks that once made sense to her, but now served only to fill time and silence her thoughts. She began to avoid the places she frequented with Daniel, not out of anger or unnecessary nostalgia, but because she understood she no longer belonged there. She walked down different streets, frequented unfamiliar cafes, adopted new habits just to convince herself she was changing. But deep down, she knew she was just trying to escape herself. No matter how much the world reconfigured itself around her, the part that truly mattered within her seemed frozen in a time that could no longer be reached. In an attempt to reorganize her life, Laura sought therapy. She needed to understand where she had gone astray. In the first sessions, her speech was defensive, justifying the betrayal as the result of a personal crisis, emotional exhaustion, or an unconscious need for attention. But as the sessions progressed, her words began to unravel. And what had previously been explained logically began to emerge as truth: she hadn't known how to love someone who loved her completely. She tried to free herself from this guilt for months, until she accepted that it wasn't guilt, but responsibility. And this responsibility she would have to bear, without expectations of absolution. One afternoon, as she was leaving the office, she ran into an old friend of the couple, someone who had always been closer to Daniel. The reunion was casual, unceremonious, but filled with memories that seemed barely buried. They talked about everyday things, until he, with the naturalness of someone who doesn't mince words, mentioned that he had seen Daniel and Sophia at a small concert in the park and that he had never seen him so light-hearted. Laura responded with a brief smile, but inside she felt as if that light-heartedness were a gentle punishment, a reminder that, for one to be happy, perhaps another must learn to live with regret. As they said goodbye, the friend hesitated and said something that would stay with her for days. "You know, I always thought you two would be together forever. But today, seeing him like this, I think it was supposed to be different." That sentence haunted her. Because, deep down, she also believed they would be together forever. And believing that made her neglect the love she received, as if she had infinite time to fix everything. The illusion that true love is indestructible prevented her from seeing that even the deepest feelings die when ignored. That was the cruelest part, believing he would wait forever. Days later, she was invited to an event at the university where she worked. She accepted, more out of obligation than desire. During the evening, amidst speeches and toasts, she crossed paths with old faces, including one that left her disconcerted, the man she had been involved with. The same man she had once believed would offer her a new chance to live something different. He approached with a disconcerted smile, made a random comment about the past, and asked if they could talk privately. Laura, on impulse or curiosity, accepted. They went to the outside area of the hall, where the sound was muffled and the lighting softer. He began by apologizing. He said he knew he'd been a coward. That, at the time, he preferred to disappear rather than face the emotional mess surrounding them. He said he'd never understood why she was with him, and that he'd always felt like she was searching for something she'd already lost. Laura listened in silence. Not because she was hurt, but because it no longer mattered. She felt nothing for that man. He was merely a reflection of a wrong choice, a thoughtless impulse, a need she couldn't bring herself to name. When he finished, she simply replied that she apologized too, but that there was nothing more there. That everything had already been said in silence, and that what remained between them was just an uncomfortable memory. The man nodded, wished her well, and returned to the living room. She stood there for a few minutes, looking up at the dark sky, feeling the breeze on her face, and recognizing, once again, that some choices aren't just mistakes, they're wounds that open too late. Later, when she got home, Laura picked up her phone and checked Daniel's contact information. It was there, safe, as always. The name on the screen looked like a static portrait of the past. She didn't have the courage to write. She didn't want to touch on that story with words anymore. She knew that any attempt at rapprochement wouldn't bring back what they'd lost. The love that had once existed had already transformed into something else. It was part of her, yes. But like a tattoo that fades with time, still visible, but without the same strength as before. She put away her phone, turned off the light, and lay down on the sofa, hugging a pillow as if that could soothe the absence. Meanwhile, Daniel went about his days at a new, calmer pace. He had learned to appreciate the silences. The simple afternoons, the long coffees, the heartfelt conversations with Sophia. He hadn't forgotten Laura, he never would. But now she inhabited a different place within him. A place where pain had given way to acceptance. Sophia knew the story, never asked for details, but respected the space Daniel needed to speak or remain silent. And that made him feel safe. For the first time, there was no competition with the past. Only the present. And that was liberating. One morning, while sorting through books at home, Daniel found an old notebook of Laura's. It had been forgotten among the shelves of his workbook. He leafed through it out of curiosity and found drafts of texts, loose ideas, and small outpourings. In one of them, there was a handwritten, undated sentence that said, "Sometimes, we only realize we've lost something eternal when we look to the side and see that the other has already rebuilt itself." He closed the notebook slowly. There was no resentment. There was a gentle sadness. And, along with it, a deep certainty that everything had followed the course it needed to. Later that day, he decided to walk to the park he usually went to when he needed to think. He sat on a bench, watched people passing by, children playing, couples walking hand in hand. He took out his cell phone and wrote a last message to Laura. Something short. Just to thank her for the letter she had left behind years before, for the story they had shared, for what he had learned from loving her. He didn't ask for a reply. He didn't expect anything in return. He simply wanted to close the cycle with the same honesty with which he had always lived that love. Laura received the message on a rainy morning. Her hair was wet, she was wrapped in an old coat, a cup of tea in her hands. Reading those words, he felt something different. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was gratitude. For having experienced such a true love, however brief. For having loved someone who knew how to leave without hatred. For having had the chance to finally understand what truly matters. He smiled, through tears, and put his phone away in the drawer. In that moment, they both knew, without needing to say it, that everything had found its place. Every mistake, every pain, every choice. Everything was part of a story that, although it had ended, would not cease to exist within them. A story that now breathed silently, without sorrow, only with the raw truth that love, when wasted, teaches more than when lived to the end. And that, no matter how much people move on, some marks remain. Not as a burden, but as proof that, once, they loved deeply. And that, even in loss, is still something worth remembering. The morning was cold, the sky covered in low clouds that seemed to weigh down the rooftops, as if time itself refused to move on. Laura walked the streets slowly, as if she had no set destination, only the need to move so as not to be swallowed by her own mind. She had just emerged from another therapy session, and although she told herself everything was under control, all it took was a single thought for reality to reimpose itself with all its harshness. There was no longer any expectation, nor was there the suffocating pain of the first few months. There was a disconcerting silence, like a post-storm calm, where everything seems too still. She was beginning to understand that the deepest suffering comes not from sudden absence, but from the permanent realization that what once existed will never exist again. She stopped in front of the old house where she had lived with Daniel and spent a few minutes observing the closed gate, the windows, the familiar structure that no longer belonged to her. She didn't want to go in, had no intention of confronting him or recovering what she'd lost. She simply wanted to take one last look at that place, as if saying goodbye to the scene of a dream already faded. On the other side of town, Daniel, unaware she was there, was having breakfast with Sophia. The table set with fruit, fresh bread, and warm tea was just another detail of the everyday that was now part of her new life. There was no need for grand gestures, no euphoria. What they shared was presence, lightness, constancy. Sophia had a way of listening that made Daniel feel understood effortlessly, and that, for him, was more valuable than any noisy passion. That same day, Daniel passed by the bookstore where he and Laura bought their first book together, years ago. He entered on impulse. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just allowed himself to wander among the shelves as if searching for something he couldn't name. He stopped in front of a dark blue-covered volume, picked it up, and flipped through a few pages. Inside, he found a scrawled inscription, left by a previous owner: "Time doesn't heal. It teaches you how to walk with pain." He smiled with a mixture of astonishment and agreement. He committed the phrase to memory, paid for the book, and left. Meanwhile, Laura began to reorganize her feelings. She decided, after a long time, to visit her parents. She had been distant from them since their separation, not because of arguments, but because of shame. Seeing her arriving, her mother hugged her tightly. Her father, more restrained, simply nodded and invited her in. During dinner, amid simple dishes and leisurely conversations, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it complete acceptance. It was something rawer, more human, the recognition that she had fallen, but that there was still a way to rise again. That silent yet firm gesture from her family made her understand that some rebuildings begin where all seemed lost. One autumn evening, while organizing her things at home, she found a new notebook and decided to write. She began with loose sentences, then full texts. It wasn't for anyone, she had no intention of publishing, she just needed to hear herself. In the middle of one of the pages, she wrote, "I learned the hard way that when someone cares for you in silence, it's because they love you deeply. And silent love, if ignored, dies without a cry. It just dies." When she finished writing, she cried softly, not out of regret, but out of relief. For the first time, she was able to transform pain into something concrete. Weeks later, Daniel was preparing a trip with Sophia. They would explore the south of the country, a region he'd always dreamed of visiting but never had the courage to plan because he thought it wasn't the right time. Now it was time. There were no more pending matters, no doubts. While packing his suitcase, he found the old photo frame with a picture of him and Laura. On impulse, he took the picture out and put it in a drawer, replacing it with a new one, a smiling photo next to Sophia, taken in the park where they met. It wasn't a gesture of erasure. It was an update. A way to make room for the new reality without erasing the importance of what had been. Because he knew that love doesn't dissolve with replacement, but is reorganized in different places in the heart. Shortly thereafter, Laura was invited to give a lecture on literature and human emotions. She spoke with authority and truth. She discussed loss, relationships, and how choices shape personal narratives. At the end, a student asked if she believed every mistake could be forgiven. Laura took a deep breath and replied that forgiveness wasn't a return to the past, but permission to move forward. And that not all forgiveness brings back what was lost. Sometimes, it simply brings the peace of knowing that, even having made a mistake, it's possible to move on. And she was applauded for this. Their story, finally, had completely ended. Not because time had healed everything, but because both of them, each in their own way, understood that some pains don't heal, they settle. Daniel now lived at peace. He was where he wanted to be, with those who saw him completely. Laura, for her part, had made peace with the mirror. He knew what he had caused, he knew what he had lost. But now I also knew who I was, and this was the first step to starting over. Not with illusions, but with awareness. If you've made it this far, tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. Which character touched you most? What part made you reflect? Your opinion is very important to us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow other stories like this, with memorable endings and lifelong lessons. This story was living proof that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys trust, dreams, a sense of home, and often even our self-image. The betrayed person doesn't just lose their partner, they lose peace, emotional security, the foundation that sustained their days. And the person who betrays, sooner or later, realizes that no amount of momentary pleasure can compensate for the void left by the absence of someone who truly loved them. Remember, this channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. The stories here are fiction, but the feelings are real. And the message is clear, those who trade true love for a moment of vanity may find forgiveness, but they will hardly find a way back.